The figure on your screen is the last openly pagan emperor of Rome. And he was not simply pagan. This emperor, in his short reign, 361 to 363, made it his business to destroy the Christian faith. He was raised Christian and with a good Christian education. This is why he came to be known by the church as Julian the Apostate after he turned against his Christian roots. And he lived in a time where Christians believed, because Jesus had prophesied against the temple, and his prophecy had been fulfilled and the Jewish temple had been destroyed, that there would never be another Jewish temple, that God was done with that. He would not allow the Jewish people to ever rebuild it again. And since Christians at that time believed this, you will notice that many Christians today don't think this. Many Christians today think the temple has to be rebuilt in order for Christ to return. That's another subject for another time. But since Christians at the time believed one could never be rebuilt, and that if one was rebuilt, then that meant Christianity was not true, Julian the Apostate set out to disprove Christianity by rebuilding the Jewish temple. Now, the building supplies caught fire. Many have linked this to a natural disaster, a earthquake that is known to have taken place in Galilee at the time. Others have said it was sabotage. The historical sources do not agree. However, the temple was not rebuilt, and Julian's life came to an end rather quickly. Now, when he was alive, though, he wrote a document known as Against the Galileans. It's a polemic against Christians, and he referred to us as Galileans in order to emphasize our lowly providence. What good thing can come from Galilee? And the primary thesis of his document is that the Old Testament does not predict Christ, and the Old Testament does not predict the church. That in fact, Christians have come along and they have taken the Jewish scriptures and we have manipulated them to say things they were never meant to say. And the passage we're looking at today, the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, this is one passage that has oftentimes been laid at Christians' feet as an example of how we misread Scripture. Jesus in the Gospels, the book of Revelation, they refer to Jesus as the Son of Man. And this is, of course, a reference to Daniel chapter 7. Son of Man is simply an Aramaism that means a human being. One like a human being came on the clouds of heaven to the Ancient of Days and received great authority from him and a kingdom, and he took control of the evil beasts who were ravishing the world. And Julian the Apostate tried to prove that Christians had been abusing the Old Testament to make it say things it was never meant to say. Now, in the modern commentaries, it's a little bit different. You will oftentimes find that biblical scholars will say the Old Testament does not predict Jesus, and particularly this passage in Daniel chapter 7, it is not about a Messiah. Many will say there is no Messiah anywhere in the book of Daniel, and that when Christians used the book of Daniel to promote Jesus, we were in fact using the book for an intention other than the one that belonged to the original writer. But in our time, it's a little bit different, though. Many scholars will not be so bitter as Julian was. They will simply say something like, Christians used the passage in a way that was not intended by the writer. However, that's okay because, they'll patronize the early Christians. They'll say that the Christians infused the text with a new life and a new meaning that was relevant to their own community. It doesn't matter what the original meaning and purpose of this prophecy was. All that matters is Christians were able to take it and make it their own and use it in a very creative way. And they'll patronize the church with that kind of modern pluralistic jargon. So what we want to do here is we want to read the text of the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. And then we want to look at the other ideas. What do scholars think this means? And then we want to demonstrate that, in fact, this is a passage about the Messiah. And enough evidence comes out of this text to point to Jesus in such a specific way that the profile of the Son of Man in this passage couldn't be about anyone else. That in fact, this is a very good place to demonstrate the Messiahship of Jesus Christ. Now we're going to pick it up in verse 9. In the previous two videos, we analyzed the four beasts, the little horn, and the Ancient of Days. Here we will focus on the saints of the Most High and, of course, on the Son of Man who comes in the clouds of heaven. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were like burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there, and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me, and made known to me the interpretation of the things. These four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth. Then I desired to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet, and about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up before which 3 of them fell, the horn that had eyes and a mouth, that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than its companions. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High. And the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, As for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down, and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law. And they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom, and the dominion, and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Here is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. Now, when it comes to identifying the Son of Man who comes on the clouds of heaven, as you can imagine, within a religious context, there have been a number of aspiring individuals who have tried to use this passage to take control of other people. I just want to provide you one entertaining example that comes from Maimonides, one of the great Jewish sages of the Middle Ages. And he wants to tell us about a cult leader in the nation of France who used this passage to prove that he was the Messiah. As he says, on moonlit nights he would go out and climb up to the tops of high trees in the field and glide from tree to tree like a bird. He cited a verse from Daniel to prove that such a miracle was within the power of the Messiah. Now he quotes our text here. And behold, there came with the clouds of heaven one like a man. Many who witnessed the miracle became his votaries. The French discovered this, pillaged and put many of his followers to death, together with the pretender. Some of them maintain, however, that he is still in hiding until this day. And so you can probably find a number of interesting manipulations of this passage throughout history. I don't know that many of them, but there are many. But what I want to focus on for the duration of this video is not just any old idea that comes out of the Dark Ages. I want to show you the conversation that modern scholarship has on Daniel chapter 7. What do modern biblical scholars say when they read this passage? Many viewers may be surprised to learn that one of the prevailing positions in scholarship on this passage is that the Son of Man who comes on the clouds of heaven is a reference to the archangel Michael. It is not a reference to the human Messiah of Israel, many interpreters will say. They'll say that's a later Christian imposition on the text, but what the author is actually trying to talk about is the angel Michael. Now, there are a number of reasons for this position. Michael represents the people of God in a unique way in Daniel chapter 11. There we will find that every nation has its own representative angels, and we will find that Israel's chief representative angel is Michael. And so just doing the context thing, many will say, look, you can't find a human Messiah for the nation of Israel anywhere else in the book of in Daniel. However, you will find this angel representing the people elsewhere. And so context suggests this is a better option. Coming with the clouds might imply a heavenly figure. And since obviously angels are heavenly figures, since they belong to the unseen realm, many have said this is a most natural option. The clouds of heaven, an angel from heaven, this is what the writer intended, many will suggest. The human appearance of angelic figures in Daniel chapter 8 is also important, because you can read this passage and you say, well, it's obviously a human being, right? One like a son of man. Well, in Daniel chapter 8, all the way through chapter 12, we find that angels oftentimes are described as having the appearance of men, as they are elsewhere in the Old Testament. In regards to Gabriel in particular, in chapter 9, it will say, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the visions at the fire. And so a number of passages here which suggest angels can have the appearance of human beings. And so proponents of this view will say this is just one more example. The War Scroll explicitly states that this figure in Daniel 7 is the angel Michael. And so we know that other Jewish documents written not long after Daniel 7 was written, we know that other Jews interpreted this way to say it's Michael. So this is not just an interpretation that was dreamed up by modern scholars. There are many ancient Jews who did not think this was the Messiah. They thought this was a reference to the angel Michael. And so there are some more things to be said, but basically those are the reasons why interpreters will say this is Michael. Now I'm going to rebut this view more fully, but right now I just want to point out that the Son of Man is not described as doing any combat in this passage, but as being honored for a kingly coronation. Now this is important because elsewhere in the book of Daniel and throughout the Old Testament, you do not see these angels being honored as kings and taking a seat or a throne in heaven. They're always involved in either delivering messages or doing some type of warfare. So if this is a reference to the angel Michael, it is highly unusual, right? It is highly unusual. We don't see Michael being enthroned or receiving a kingdom anywhere else in the Old Testament. He is usually a warrior. And so that is one strike against the view that this is Michael. However, there is much more that we will say about this. Now, there are going to be others who say that the Son of Man need not correspond to a human Messiah, and the Son of Man, in fact, need not correspond to an angel, whether Michael, Gabriel, or any of the others. But rather, the Son of Man is just a symbol that represents the people of Israel. Right? So just as the lion represents all the people of Babylon, so the Son of Man represents all the people of Israel. He's not a specific historical figure. He is a symbol for a historical people. Now, the reason people will say this is if you look at the description, what happens to the Son of Man? He is glorified and he receives a kingdom. Well, if you read down through the rest of the chapter, you'll find that this is exactly what happens to the saints of the Most High. In verse 18, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever, and ever. Verse 22, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. And then again in verse 27, and the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. And so they'll say, look, the Son of Man is simply a symbolic apocalyptic way of representing the people of Israel. It need not refer to a specific figure. Now, much more commonly, you're going to find that people say it's both, that it is both Michael and Israel. And the reason why it's both is because, again, Michael is Israel's representative. So yes, you will go through this chapter and you see that the Son of Man is glorified and the people of Israel are glorified. But that doesn't mean there's no distinction between them at all. It's that Michael, as Israel's representative angel, when he is glorified, his country, Israel, is glorified with him. You'll find that a great many scholars think that this is in fact the way to read it. So the Son of Man is a personal representative of the nation of Israel. But again, it is Michael, and as he is glorified, so the people are glorified. Now, I want to show you why this should not be Michael. Yes, it is going to be the case that the Son of Man represents the people of Israel, but it's going to be a human Messiah. It's not going to be an angel. And one of the reasons for this is that other peoples in this passage have been represented by human kings. Remember that each one of the beasts was not just a country, it was also their human king, right? The lion with eagle's wings, this was not the angelic representative of Babylon. It was the human representative of Babylon. As you'll remember from the video before last, in Daniel 7:4, the first beast was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. When we treated this passage, we talked at length how this is a discussion on what happened to Nebuchadnezzar back in Daniel chapter 4. He was lowered to the status of a beast for 7 years. And then after that time, his sanity was restored to him. And so the lion with eagle's wings, this not only represents Babylon, it represents their human king. You see the same thing when you compare verses 17 and 13. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth, right? So they're not 4 heavenly angelic kings who represent these nations. They are 4 human kings who arise out of the earth. And then again in verse 23, thus he said, as for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on the earth. And so these beasts both represent nations and their human kings, not their angelic kings. And then again, we saw that the king of the 4th beast represents a specific historical figure. He shall speak words against the Most High and wear out the saints of the Most High. And he shall think to change times and laws. Now, you will remember from the last video that some people think this refers to Antiochus Epiphanes, who persecuted the Jewish people and tried to destroy the Bible and kill anyone who was found in possession of a Bible. Others will say this is about the Antichrist, and many will say it's both, that Antiochus Epiphanes was a forerunner and a preview to the Antichrist. Now, for our purposes here, what's important is that each one of these other beasts represented a nation collectively and its human king. And so we should expect the same of Israel in this passage. Yes, the Son of Man represents the nation collectively, and it also represents their human king, right? Which, of course, the Israelites would understand this to be a descendant of David. They would not think this to be an angel. Now, before we can move any farther along in analyzing the identity of the Son of Man to determine whether it's Jesus or Michael, we need to first take stock of this phrase, saints of the Most High, because the saints of the Most High are those who are being represented here by the Son of Man who comes on the clouds of heaven. Now, when you hear this phrase, saints of the Most High, you say, duh, that's God's people. This is a reference to those who keep covenant with the Lord. Well, for Old Testament scholars, it's not going to be quite that simple, because the Aramaic language here corresponds to language that is used elsewhere in the Old Testament, usually about beings that are in heaven, not about people who are on the earth, not about Israel. I'll give you an example of where this language is used. It's used of the divine council in Psalm 89. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord, a God greatly to be feared in the council of his holy ones? That is the phrase there. And awesome above all who are around him. Now, when I was putting this together, I thought I might provide you with loads of examples. I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm just going to list them there. You can see there's a long list of places where this language is used, and it is definitely used in reference to heavenly beings. Only in Psalm 34 and verse 9 does the noun clearly refer to human beings. This language is almost always used of heavenly beings. So what is going on here? Well, here we find that the earthly people of God, the saints, the people of Israel, the people who keep covenant with the Lord, they are being described as though they have heavenly existence. As Pace says, by portraying a scene where faithful holy ones receive the kingdom, the author may be integrating both these images of holy ones in heaven and holy ones on earth. This especially seems to be the case when we consider that the phrase holy ones readily becomes the people of the holy ones in verse 27, right? So the language gets expanded. Holy ones by itself, usually just a reference to beings who are in heaven, who make up the heavenly host, but it gets expanded to the people of the holy ones, letting us know we're talking about people here. With this fluid identification, images of both heavenly and human beings are among the conquered or persecuted and serve as witnesses for hope. And so, this is important here. We are talking about the earthly people of God, but we're talking about them as though they are angels, as though they are heavenly beings. Right? That is important to recognize as we move forward. So this is definitely a discussion of the faithful people of Israel, but they are being discussed as though they have heavenly authority and heavenly status. Human beings are being depicted here as upgraded to the level of the divine council. Now, this is important because the divine council, these heavenly beings, these are those to whom Yahweh has delegated authority to make decisions in the cosmos. In fact, this is, just to skip way ahead, this is what the New Testament writers are referring to when they call us the saints, the holy ones. This is the phraseology they're using. They're referring to, as Paul discusses in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, the fact that our destiny is to rule over angels, to rule over the cosmos, to be those who make decisions in God's universe. All right, that's what's being referred to here. The mere human beings of Israel who suffer the persecutions under the little horn, they will be upgraded to the level of the divine council. And the sequence is important. First, they are depicted as suffering under the beast, and then later as receiving heavenly authority. Now, the one like a son of man comes with the clouds to heaven from earth. Now, this is important, all right, because the Son of Man, whoever he is, he reflects the experience of his people. His people suffer and are persecuted, but later on they will receive heavenly authority over the cosmos. Well, like so, the Son of Man, the clouds are essentially a vehicle here. He has an earthly existence, and then he travels to heaven from the earth. Now, This is important. Remember, in the book of Acts, it's a cloud that receives Jesus so that he could go and be seated at the right hand of the Father. That's what's taking place here. You have to have the Son of Man on earth before he can go on the clouds and be presented before the Ancient of Days. So whoever the Son of Man is, he first has an earthly existence and then a heavenly existence, just like the people of God here have an earthly and then a heavenly existence, suggesting again that this cannot be an angel because the angel never had an earthly existence. He always had a heavenly existence. It also parallels Nebuchadnezzar's upgrade from a beast to a man in verse 4. Israel's representative is described with Yahwistic language, and the saints are upgraded to heavenly status. And so remember in the Bible who it is that rides on the clouds of heaven. See, the Son of Man is not just a human being being upgraded to a heavenly authoritarian status, just like his people. He's, in fact, a bit more than that. Because as Daniel would well know, throughout the Old Testament, the only one who rides upon the clouds of heaven is Yahweh himself. Psalm 68, sing to God, sing praises to his name. Extol him who rides on the clouds. His name is the Lord, and rejoice before him. Psalm 104, he makes the clouds his chariot and rides on the wings of the wind. He makes winds his messengers, flames of fire his servants. And other passages could be added to this, such as Isaiah chapter 19, where Yahweh rides on the clouds of heaven to come to Egypt for the sake of judging its idols. And so the Son of Man is not simply someone who has an earthly existence, who gets graduated to heavenly authority. He is someone who is in some sense the embodiment of Israel's God, the embodiment of Yahweh himself. He is a divine Messiah, right? What else could be understood by him riding on the clouds of heaven when elsewhere in the Bible, the only one who rides on the clouds is Yahweh? Angels are not described as riding upon the clouds. This is specifically Yahwistic language. Now, I want to unpack something that I alluded to a moment ago. The parallel of a categorical upgrade between Nebuchadnezzar and the Son of Man also draws attention to the fact that only these two figures receive Adamic descriptions. So, within the framework of about 10 verses, you have a symbolic presentation of Nebuchadnezzar's upgrade and also Israel's representatives' upgrade. So when the lion has eagle's wings and the wings are plucked and it's given the mind of a man, this is a reference to what happened back in Daniel chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar had the status and the functionality of a beast for 7 years, and then he is upgraded and his humanity is restored from him. But here you have the Son of Man. He has an earthly human existence, and then he comes on the clouds of heaven to come into the status of a heavenly authoritarian. He goes from human to divine status, as where Nebuchadnezzar goes from beast to human status. Two upgrades within the frame of about 10 verses. And the interesting thing is that both of them, Nebuchadnezzar and Israel's representative, are depicted as a kind of Adam. Remember that back when humankind was created, it says, God said, let us make man, that is Adam. Here it's a reference to both Adam and Eve, actually. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over the creeping things that creep on the earth. Well, the Son of Man here is given authority over unruly beasts. Right? This is an Adam scene. Just as in Genesis chapter 2, Adam comes and he names the animals. In the ancient world, to name something is to have authority over it. So you have these beasts, which represent political entities and their kings, and they are ravishing the world. Well, you need another Adam to come along and take charge over the beasts. And so that's what happens here with the Son of Man. He is playing the role of new Adam, taking over the animals. And so that's one thing that we can be confident about in its own right. You have someone taking control of the animals. A Jew would understand, oh, this is a kind of new Adam. But we can be all the more sure because he's discussed in the vicinity of another figure who's already been compared to Adam. Nebuchadnezzar has been compared to the tree of life and is given authority to reign over the animals. So it's interesting how in Daniel 4, the Genesis imagery kind of gets mixed together. Nebuchadnezzar is in one sense the very tree of life in the imagery, and in another sense he is Adam. It says that the animals were under his branches, he fed them, he has authority over the animals. And so this is one more thing that we want to hold in mind. Whoever the Son of Man is, he is in some sense a new Adam. Now I want to put the nail in the coffin for the idea that this could be Michael or any angel. It is true that the Son of Man, whoever he is, must reflect the experience of the saints in this passage. And the saints do receive a kingdom, they receive heavenly authority, and the Son of Man receives a kingdom and heavenly authority. However, they have more experience than simply being promoted and having, a coronation. They also suffer. And as we'll see in the following chapters, the suffering here includes martyrdom and death. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. Now this is a description here of God's people suffering this terrible martyrdom under the reign of the little horn. Now, whoever the Son of Man is then, if he corresponds to these people and their experience in this chapter, he must also suffer and die under human authorities, under tyrannical human authorities. Now, can that be said of the angel Michael? No. Can that be said of the man Jesus? Well, of course it can be said of him, right? And this is so important. You can't just say this is an angel, because the Son of Man shares and represents the experience of the people of the saints throughout this chapter. And that means whoever the Son of Man is, he has to suffer. And therefore, he has to be a human Messiah, and he has to be a suffering human Messiah. We've looked at a lot of different information and arguments, and I just want to summarize my primary points here. Who is the Son of Man? First of all, he is a human king who represents God's people, just as the beasts were pagan kings who represented pagan peoples. He is like Adam. 1 Corinthians 5, Romans 5, a number of passages should come to mind. All the passages in John's Gospel where the author places Jesus in a garden because he wants you to make that association. He knows that Adam was a gardener. And this is done because Jesus is the forefather of a new humanity. Just as Adam was the father of the old humanity for the old creation, so Jesus is the creator of a new humanity destined for a new creation. The Son of Man is described with both human and divine characteristics. One like a son of man, right? That's Son of Man again. It's just an Aramaic way of saying a human being. But he also comes on the clouds of heaven. Only Yahweh does that in Scripture, and he is enthroned in heaven. So we are talking about a Messiah here that is both human and divine. He comes into heavenly authority after an earthly life. Now this is important. Think of the book of Acts again, of Jesus being received up into a cloud, into heaven, that he can sit at the right hand of the Father. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, he must continue to reign at the right hand of Father until all enemies are placed under his feet. His suffering reflects that of his people. Again, this is the nail in the coffin, that it could be Michael or some angel. Whoever this is, it is someone who suffers incredibly, and his suffering must be on a scale as to match the torment and the martyrdom of the saints, as we will see here, not just in Daniel 7, but for the next several chapters until the conclusion of the book. All of these points about the Son of Man force us to conclude that Jesus is the Son of Man. This is not like Julian the Apostate said, where the church is just making stuff up and making the Bible say things about Jesus that it was never designed to say. This is not as it is with many modern scholars where we say, well, there is no Messiah in the book of Daniel. However, it doesn't matter. At least the Christians were creative and they used the text in a way that could benefit their own community. No, 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 no. The simple fact of the matter is, when you look at the Son of Man and you analyze the Son of Man in his own literary context in the book of Daniel, these are the points that can be inferred from the text. And all of these taken together, I think, form a very sharp profile for Jesus as you have him in the Gospels. This is not something that the early Christians made up out of thin air. There literally is no other person in history who could match these descriptions like Jesus, and therefore it is no stroke of imagination to say that Jesus is the Son of Man. It is, in fact, I think, the most natural conclusion to make of the text. Now, I want to take just a little bit of time to talk about how this phrase Son of Man is used in the New Testament in relationship to Jesus, and just look at a few specific and interesting examples. The book of Revelation uses this phrase, but it's interesting how it uses it, because in the book of Daniel, you have the two figures. You have the Son of Man, and he's associated with fire, and he has white hair. Signifying his ancientness, his timelessness. And then you have the Son of Man as a second figure who approaches him to receive authority. But look at what John does in Revelation. I saw the one like the Son of Man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash across his chest. His head and his hair were white as white wool, white as snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. So notice what John has done. He has conflated these two images. He has taken some of the imagery, the white hair and the fire, of the Ancient of Days, of God who's sitting on the throne, and then he has taken imagery of the Son of Man, and he has collapsed them together. He's done this. He's conflated these two figures into one figure here, not because there is no distinction at all in the book of Revelation between the Father and the Son. There certainly is. But he has done this to show you the divinity of Jesus. He thinks, how can I show that the Messiah is the Son of Man? And so he describes his visions in such a way as the Son of Man actually ends up having some of the characteristics of the Ancient of Days, and therefore you can know that Jesus is divine. Now, the Gospels are especially interesting in how they use this language. The Old Testament, especially the Old Greek, which is the translation that seems to have influenced the Gospel writers the most, it says, one like a Son of Man came. Now, after he comes into the company of these heavenly beings and this divine council that has this sort of cosmic authority. He comes that he might take up residence with these other authoritative beings. Now, it's interesting how this phraseology shows up in the Gospels. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking. And you say, behold, a gluttonous man and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. Now, this is interesting. G.K. Bill remarks on this. He says, in contrast to Daniel chapter 7, which portrays the Son of Man surrounded by an angelic royal host as he approaches the heavenly divine throne to receive a kingdom, Luke strikingly depicts those who surround the coming of the Son of Man not as angels, but as Jesus' retinue of tax collectors and sinners. So why is Luke doing this? Well, what is with the gospel authors? Well, they know that Daniel describes the Son of Man as coming to be around these other amazing and important and heavenly beings. And so when they depict the Son of Man as coming to be around tax collectors and sinners and the lost, that is their way of saying, look, these are the people who are going to make up the divine council. These are the people that Jesus is going to reign with in eternity. It's like if I were to say, Mark took his company with a band of idiots. And then right after that, I said, Mark took his company with Kurt and Justin. Well, you would know that Kurt and Justin are idiots. So when Daniel says that the Son of Man comes to take up residence with these other authoritative beings in heaven, and then the gospel authors say the Son of Man comes to take up residence with drunkards and sinners and tax collectors and the lost, etc., then you know what is being said here. Jesus is going to take these lowly and unimpressive people, and again, he's going to promote them and give them such a status as these heavenly beings in Daniel chapter 7. Now let's go back to Daniel chapter 7 and talk about verse 17 for a moment. It says, "These four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth." Now some have seen a conflict here with verse 2, which says that the wind aggravates the sea and then the beasts come up out of the sea. Well, do they come out of the sea as at the beginning of the chapter, or do they come up out of the earth as in later on in the chapter? Well, you don't want to make the mistake of applying a sort of a Western systematician's logic to Daniel chapter 7, or in fact to any apocalyptic. Apocalyptic is not designed so that all the imagery has to agree with all the other imagery all the time. That's just not the way apocalyptic literature works. We have different theological emphases here. The sea carries a certain sort of meaning and association, and the earth carries a certain sort of meaning and association. The chaotic sea and the sea monster in the Old Testament often represent the chaos that degrades and threatens creation. God has designed the creation to be orderly, to be functional, etc. And whenever you see the sea in play, life is being threatened or order is being threatened. That's the way sea is used throughout the Bible. And so when these beasts come up from the sea, it's to show that they are threatening God's good order of things. However, the earth has a different connotation. As Lucas says, the point being made in verse 18 is that these kingdoms are of an earthly human origin. This contrasts with the kingdom symbolized by the one like a son of man, which has a heavenly divine origin. So we have a conflict of kingdoms here, a kingdom from above, which is represented by the Messiah and the saints, and then the kingdoms from below, which are the pagans and the pagan kings and the beasts. And so, there are kingdoms from earth and there are kingdoms from heaven. That is the point here in saying that these beasts arise out of the earth. And to miss that and to play this off against verse 2, where they come up out of the seas, is just to miss the point. Right? We have heavenly kingdoms, we have earthly kingdoms. That is the point here. Now, the book of Revelation takes this principle and expands it tremendously. In Daniel 7, you have a heavenly kingdom represented by the saints, and you have earthly kingdom represented by the beastly nations. Well, in the book of Revelation, we're always going to have this conflict between those who belong to heaven and those who belong to earth. Now, you don't want to misunderstand this when you read the book of Revelation, right? The heavenly people are on the earth, right? They're going to be described as though they're in heaven, to show that they have heavenly identity. And the earthly people are not the only people who are literally on the planet. They're just described as earthly people because they have earthly identity. In the book of Revelation, it's not about where you are, it's about who you are. If you are a heavenly people, you're going to be described as though you're in heaven, even when you're on the earth. And if you are an earthly people, you're going to be described as being on the earth, even though you're not the only ones who are on the earth. Right? We talked about this a lot in the book of Revelation. If you're interested in that, I did a whole series of videos going all the way through the book of Revelation. I highly recommend that you go and check those out. But I want to give you some examples of this. Those who dwell on the earth in the book of Revelation is technical language for the pagans. It's for the people who have earthly identity. They're not the only people on the planet. The martyrs say, in chapter 6, it says, "They cried out with a loud voice, saying, 'How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you not refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth?'" Well, do they want to be avenged on all who literally live on the planet? Well, no, because in the context, there will be Christians on the earth, right? So those who dwell on the earth must be technical language for the wicked. You see this again later on. "And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and celebrate, and they will send gifts to one another, because these two prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth." Now this is those who dwell on the earth celebrating because they've killed the two witnesses. Now it says those who dwell on the earth are going to rejoice. But again, in this very chapter, we will find that there are still Christians in the world. So those who dwell on the earth is not everybody. Chapter 13, "All who dwell on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name is not written in the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who's been slain. Well, a few verses later, we're going to find that there are Christians on the earth who won't worship him, and therefore they are put to death. All those who dwell on the earth is a reference to the wicked. Revelation gets this from Daniel 7, where there are earthly people who are not all earthlings, right? Some people on the earth are heavenly people. This works the other way as well. Oftentimes in the book of Revelation, those who dwell in heaven are not literally those who are in heaven. They're actually on the earth, but they're discussed as dwelling in heaven because they have a heavenly identity. As Paul says in Colossians, we are seated with Christ in heavenly places. In Revelation 13, it talks about the beast. It says it opened its mouth to utter slanders against God, slandering his name and his tabernacle, those who dwell in heaven. Well, if you read Revelation, especially chapter 2, you know those who are getting slandered by the beast are actually on the earth. In fact, you read this text in Revelation 13 in context, and you'll find that everything he does there is against Christians who are on the earth. So when it describes them as those who dwell in heaven, this is again about identity, not about placement. Chapter 11, these are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. Now this is interesting because it's talking about the two prophets who witness. Everyone else in this book who stands before the Lord of the earth is before his throne in heaven, such as the cherubim or the 144,000 who stand before the Lord in Revelation chapter 7. But notice that after describing them as standing before the Lord of the earth, it says, and if anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. And if anyone would harm them, this is how he is doomed to be killed. So even though they're standing before the Lord, they're actually on the earth. And finally, the church is compared to angels at several junctures. And this is because angels, again, are these beings who live in heaven. So the church, while it's on earth, is described as angelic in many, many passages. All of this is an expansion of this theme in Daniel chapter 7, where you have earthly and heavenly peoples who are on the earth based on your identity. Are you in covenant with Yahweh? Then you are a heavenly people even while you're on earth. Are you in covenant with the beast? Well, then you're an earthly people, and that's all you are. You never graduate from that to become a heavenly people. And so this is the end of 3 videos on Daniel chapter 7, a big and complex chapter, but definitely foundational for how the New Testament writers understand who we are in Christ and where we're going.